World War II had no shortage of generals. Some were bold, some were brilliant, and some were just lucky enough to survive their own mistakes. But only a few actually shaped the outcome of the war through battlefield leadership, commanding troops, making calls under fire, and turning chaos into victory. This video is about them, the field generals, the commanders who didn't just wear the uniform, they earned their legacy in blood, grit, and decision-making when it mattered most. But before we dive into our ranking, we've got to talk about a few big names who didn't make the cut. Charles de Gaulle. He didn't command battalions across Europe, he didn't lead an army into Berlin, but Charles de Gaulle gave France something far more important in 1940: defiance. While Paris fell and Vichy bowed, de Gaulle climbed into a BBC studio and told the world that France was not finished, and millions listened. From exile in London, he built the Free French Forces from scratch, an army of volunteers, colonial troops, and resistance fighters who believed in a France that still fought. He clashed constantly with Churchill, annoyed the hell out of Roosevelt, and never once stopped demanding that France be treated as a power, even when he had no divisions to back it up. And when Paris was liberated, it wasn't Eisenhower or Montgomery who marched down the Champs-Élysées. It was him. De Gaulle gave France its pride back, but he didn't lead major campaigns on the battlefield after 1940, and that's why he isn't on the list. He was a politician in uniform, a master of symbolism and statecraft, but not a frontline commander in the mold of the others. His war was waged with speeches, not salvos. George C. Marshall. George Marshall never led a charge, never commanded from the front, but he might have been the most important general of the war. As US Army Chief of Staff, he built a fighting force of over 8 million men, chose the commanders who would win the war, and coordinated a global strategy that spanned continents. D-Day, he planned. North Africa, he greenlit it. The Pacific Theater, he resourced it. And he did it all without chasing fame. Churchill called him the organizer of victory, and FDR trusted him so much that he offered him command of the Normandy invasion. Marshall turned it down because he knew his place was in Washington running the machine. That's why Marshall doesn't appear in the rankings. His war wasn't waged on the battlefields, it was waged behind the scenes. He didn't lead campaigns, he empowered others to lead them. He was the architect, not the executor. Alan Brooke. While Churchill roared in speeches and Montgomery made headlines, Alan Brooke kept Britain's military strategy grounded in reality. As chief of the Imperial General Staff, he was the top military advisor to the Prime Minister and often the only voice in the room brave enough to say no. He crafted Allied strategy, balanced egos, coordinated with Americans, and ensured Britain didn't overextend itself. Brooke was the quiet force behind British successes from El Alamein to Normandy. He wasn't loved by all, but he was respected by everyone who mattered, and that's exactly why he lands here. Brooke never commanded troops in the field during World War II. He was a master of grand strategy, not battlefield execution. He shaped the war from the top. Josip Broz Tito. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, surrounded by Axis forces and abandoned by traditional allies, Tito built a partisan army that bled the Wehrmacht dry. His resistance fighters weren't just harassing the enemy, they were liberating cities, derailing trains, and tying down entire German divisions that could have fought elsewhere. By war's end, Tito had done what few others did. He liberated his own country without needing allied armies to do it for him. And he did it while outmaneuvering Stalin, charming Churchill, and refusing to bow to either. But while his impact was undeniable, Tito's war was fought in the shadows, through sabotage, ambush, and guerrilla warfare. He didn't command large-scale armies and open field operations, or coordinate multi-army offensives like the generals on our list. His war was different, and that's what kept him just outside the rankings. Chiang Kai-shek. For 8 long years, China fought a war most of the world tried to ignore. With Japanese forces rampaging across the mainland, Chiang Kai-shek held together a fractured nation and waged a grinding, brutal campaign that tied down over 1 million enemy troops. He did it while navigating the razor's edge of civil war, balancing foreign aid and refusing to be anyone's puppet. Not Washington's, not Moscow's. Chiang's China didn't win fast, but it didn't break either. And yet, his battlefield record tells a harder truth. Chiang's leadership was cautious, rigid, and often marked by missed opportunities and internal dysfunction. He was a political general who preserved a front, but never truly mastered the battlefield. That's why he didn't make the cut. Now on to our rankings proper. Number 26, Alphonse Juin. In the rocky hellscapes of central Italy, where Allied offensives stalled and German defenses refused to break, one general saw opportunity where others saw deadlock. Alphonse Juin, leading the French Expeditionary Corps, turned a patchwork of under-equipped colonial units into a battlefield scalpel, precise, deadly, and unstoppable in the mountains. While the Allies battered their heads against Monte Cassino, Juin's troops, the Moroccan Goumiers, climbed, cut, and clawed through terrain the Germans thought impassable, flanking elite Axis units and opening the gates to the Liri Valley. Among generals, he was feared and deeply respected. A sharp mind wrapped in iron pragmatism. He understood terrain like few others, and he understood his men even better. His colonial soldiers fought with ferocity, driven by loyalty to a leader who knew how to unleash their strengths. While others bogged down in the valleys, Juin took the high ground and rewrote the script. After the war, France made him a marshal, one of the highest honors in its military tradition. He became a voice of reform and modern strategy. Ask those who fought beside him, and they'll tell you. In Italy's hardest campaign, Alphonse Juin was the general who broke the deadlock and kept the offensive moving forward. Number 25, Harold Alexander. Tall, polished, and composed to a fault, Harold Alexander looked less like a general and more like a movie star cast to play one. But beneath the gentleman's exterior was a commander built for chaos, one who could hold the line when things fell apart and hold alliances together when egos ran hot. He made his name at Dunkirk, orchestrating one of the most miraculous retreats in modern military history. Where others saw disaster, Alexander brought order. He got his men out, kept command structure intact, and earned a quiet reputation, unshakable under fire. That steadiness carried him through the early disasters in Burma, where he faced impossible odds against the Japanese, but still managed to impress Churchill. And that was all it took. From there, Alexander was handed the reins to some of the most politically delicate campaigns of the war. In North Africa, he served as the diplomatic glue between Montgomery's 8th Army in the east and Eisenhower's forces in the west. The Tunisia campaign wasn't won by raw firepower alone, it was won by syncing up personalities, supply chains, and shifting fronts across thousands of miles of desert. Alexander didn't crack under pressure. He cracked the Axis instead. Then came Italy, a campaign that was as brutal as it was political. Narrow mountain passes, entrenched German defenses, endless rain and mud, and some of the most combustible Allied personalities of the war. Alexander had to juggle Montgomery's ego, Mark Clark's ambition, and resource shortfalls that came with being second priority to Normandy. Still, under his steady hand, the Allies broke through the Gustav Line, took Rome, and forced a German surrender in the south. It was a slow grind, but it never fell apart. Some said he was too hands-off, too cautious, but what he understood better than most was that in coalition warfare, managing friction was sometimes more important than chasing speed. And in a war where egos clashed as often as armies, that made him invaluable. After the war, he was promoted to Field Marshal and appointed Governor General of Canada, roles that matched his talent for diplomacy and dignity. Alexander wasn't the loudest general or the most brilliant, but he was the one you called when the stakes were high, the partners were tense, and failure wasn't an option. Number 24, Miles Dempsey. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but when the Allies needed someone to command one of the largest armies in Europe, they handed the reins to Miles Dempsey. And he delivered again and again. From the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy to the final push into the heart of Germany, Dempsey led the British Second Army with quiet precision. He didn't court headlines, he didn't chase glory, he simply got the job done, efficiently, professionally, and with the kind of calm that kept tens of thousands of soldiers moving forward through some of the war's toughest campaigns. On D-Day, it was Dempsey's men who landed at Sword Beach and began the long, grinding campaign through northern France. Operation Goodwood, Operation Market Garden, the crossing of the Rhine, the final thrust into Germany. Dempsey was at the center of it all, steering massive formations through narrow lanes, fortified towns, and rivers that had to be crossed under fire. In a war that rewarded both boldness and discipline, Dempsey leaned into the latter and made it work. He was a soldier's soldier, respected by his men and trusted by commanders like Montgomery and Eisenhower. He didn't let ego get in the way. He didn't demand the spotlight. His leadership kept morale steady, his formations intact, and his objectives met. And in a campaign where every mile cost blood, that kind of consistency was invaluable. History hasn't made him a household name. Overshadowed by bigger personalities, Dempsey tends to disappear into the background of post-war memory. But talk to those who served under him, and you'll hear a different story. You'll hear about a commander who was fair, unflinching, and laser-focused on the mission. A general who never cracked, never wavered, and never made it about himself. Dempsey didn't shape doctrine or redefine warfare, but he shaped victory one grueling mile at a time. Number 23, Walter Mödel. While Rommel raced across deserts and Guderian led panzer blitzes, Walter Mödel earned his name doing something far less glamorous: not losing. He was the Wehrmacht's fireman, the man they called when fronts collapsed, divisions disintegrated, and disaster seemed inevitable. Mödel didn't chase glory. He dragged victory out of failure's jaws, turned retreats into fighting withdrawals, and made the Allies bleed for every step forward. When everyone else was failing, he was still holding the line. He started the war as a staff officer, sharp, cold, analytical, but once he got a frontline command, it was clear. This man thrived in chaos. On the Eastern Front, during the meat grinder of Rzhev and the nightmare of Kursk, Mödel earned his brutal reputation. He counterattacked when others hesitated, held positions that looked indefensible, and turned whole sectors into fortified death traps. His true masterpiece, though, came in 1944. After Operation Bagration vaporized Army Group Center, Mödel was dropped into the wreckage, and within days, he had a line reformed and the Soviets stalled. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't the total collapse it could have been. That was his genius: contain the disaster. And then, like clockwork, he was sent west, just in time to stop the bleeding after the Allies broke out from Normandy. Mödel took over Army Group B and did what he always did: assessed the mess, locked it down, and held fast. When Operation Market Garden threatened a rapid Allied advance into Germany, it was Mödel who slammed the door shut at Arnhem. He didn't need weeks of planning. He saw the gap, moved the pieces, and crushed the spearhead. He was an executor, a master of rapid response, layered defenses, and ruthless efficiency. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't beg for reinforcements. He made do with what he had and made it count. His leadership was harsh, his personality blunt, and his reputation among troops more respected than loved. But the Allies feared him, and when Montgomery calls you one of the toughest opponents he ever faced, that says something. Walter Mödel won no sweeping victories, but he may have been the most useful general Germany had in the final years of the war. A man who turned defeat into delay and delay into survival. He didn't win battles, he prevented annihilations. And that's why, when the walls came down, he was always the last one holding the line. Number 22. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. While de Gaulle reclaimed France's voice on the world stage, Jean de Lattre de Tassigny reclaimed its honor on the battlefield. He wasn't the most political French general of World War II, but he was the one who fought. Rifle in hand, troops at his back, and a burning belief that France still mattered in a war that had nearly erased it from the map. He started in defeat. During the 1940 invasion, de Lattre commanded a division that actually counterattacked while the rest of France collapsed. When the Republic fell, he stayed with the Vichy army until he didn't. By 1943, he was in prison for resistance activity, and by 1944, he'd broken out, fled to North Africa, and was handed command of French Army B, the force that would become the First French Army. That's when de Lattre went to war for real. His troops landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon, overshadowed by Normandy, but no less crucial. In weeks, de Lattre's army raced north, liberating Marseille, Toulon, and Lyon. He didn't lead from behind, he was often at the front, rallying troops with a mix of fire and defiance. He pushed hard, took ground fast, and defied orders when they didn't make sense. Because for de Lattre, this wasn't just about strategy, it was about redemption. By early 1945, his forces had crossed the Rhine, captured key cities in southwestern Germany, and surged into Austria. His was the only French army on the Western Front, and it mattered. When the guns fell silent, de Lattre was one of 5 Allied commanders to sign Germany's unconditional surrender in Berlin. France had been there at the start. In part thanks to him, it was there at the end. De Lattre's battlefield record was impressive, not for scale but for impact. He rebuilt a broken army from colonial units, free French fighters, and ex-Vichy troops. He held it together, and then he led it across rivers, through mountain passes, and into occupied cities, and never lost momentum. His command style was aggressive, personal, and improvisational. He wasn't done rewriting doctrine, but he was adapting to terrain, to politics, to the realities of a fractured force in a fast-moving war. He wasn't a grand strategist or a theorist. He was a builder, a fighter, a man who took what France had left and turned it into something the world had to respect again. After the war, he was elevated to Marshal of France and became a national symbol of dignity through defiance. Even in Indochina, at the end of his life, he was still leading from the front, until illness finally pulled him off the battlefield. De Lattre isn't always mentioned alongside the titans of World War II, but every inch of ground his army took was a step toward restoring a nation's pride. He didn't do it with speeches, he did it with tanks, infantry, and sheer will. Number 21. Władysław Anders. Władysław Anders never fought for glory, he fought for a country that no longer existed on the map. When Poland was carved up by Hitler and Stalin, Anders didn't vanish into history, he became a living reminder that the Polish fight wasn't over. Captured by the Soviets in 1939 and imprisoned in the infamous Lubyanka, he survived torture, interrogation, and years of the Gulag. Then, when Germany turned on its former Soviet ally, Stalin needed allies. Anders was released and immediately began rebuilding an army from the ground up, using nothing but exile, grit, and memory. That army, what became known as Anders' army, was unlike any other in World War II. Formed from Polish POWs, civilians, and Gulag survivors scattered across the USSR, it was a force held together by shared trauma and national purpose. Anders led them out of the Soviet Union through Iran, across the Middle East, and into Italy. Anders' defining moment came at Monte Cassino, one of the most brutal and symbolic battles of the Italian campaign. Allied forces had been stalled for months, unable to break through the German Gustav Line. It was Anders' Polish Second Corps that finally stormed the monastery atop the mountain under withering fire across a blood-soaked slope already littered with Allied dead. When they raised the Polish flag over the ruins, it wasn't just a battlefield victory, it was a message to the world. Poland still fights. He continued to lead the Polish Corps through the remainder of the Italian campaign, helping drive the Germans northward in a grinding series of offensives that showcased both tactical skill and unshakable morale. Anders was calm under pressure, daring when needed, and deeply loyal to the men who had followed him across continents. His command wasn't the largest, but it was among the most determined. He refused to bend to Soviet pressure and was openly critical of the Yalta Agreement, which handed post-war Poland to Stalin's control. As a result, his forces were left in exile. He never returned to communist Poland, dying in London in 1970, a general without a country, buried with his men in the same soil they bled for at Monte Cassino. Number 20. Rodion Malinovsky. In a Soviet high command filled with iron-willed brawlers and political survivors, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky stood out for one thing: clean, professional, and lethal execution. He didn't yell, he didn't grandstand, he just crushed German army groups and kept moving. By the midpoint of the war, Malinovsky had quietly become one of Stalin's most trusted frontline generals, and by the end, he was leading some of the most powerful Soviet offensives of 1944 and 45. If Zhukov was the hammer and Rokossovsky the artist, Malinkovsky was the scalpel, razor-sharp, methodical, and utterly effective. Malinovsky's early background was already impressive. He'd fought in World War I, joined the Bolsheviks in the Civil War, and even served as a military advisor in the Spanish Civil War. When World War II broke out, he was commanding a corps during the 1941 retreat, but unlike many others, he survived the chaos and quickly rose. His breakthrough came in 1942 when he was given command of the 66th Army and later the 2nd Guards Army, just in time for Stalingrad. Malinovsky played a key role in Operation Uranus, the encirclement of Paulus's 6th Army. His forces helped close the trap, and once the Germans were surrounded, he took part in tightening the noose. From there, Malinovsky just kept climbing. He was given command of the Southwestern Front, then the 3rd Ukrainian Front, leading a series of rapid, high-impact offensives across the southern USSR, Romania, Hungary, and Austria. His campaigns were textbook Soviet deep operations, armor-heavy, artillery-led, fast, and relentless. In 1944, he led the liberation of Odessa and Tiraspol, then rolled into Romania, delivering the crushing defeat that helped knock the country out of the Axis. Then came Hungary, where Malinovsky's front conducted the siege of Budapest, a brutal, bloody urban fight that ended with the annihilation of German forces in the city. In early 1945, Malinovsky advanced into Austria, helping capture Vienna after a lightning campaign. His coordination with Tolbukin's neighboring front was tight and professional, showing his knack for coalition-style operations, even within the famously rigid Soviet command. He's remembered as one of the USSR's most professional and capable generals, the one who could be counted on to execute complex operations without chaos or drama. In the West, he's often overshadowed by Zhukov and the larger-than-life figures of the Eastern Front, but among historians of Soviet military history, Malinovsky is right there in the top tier. His campaigns in southern Europe were decisive, and his influence lasted long after 1945. And he ended the war not just in Vienna, but also as one of the Soviet commanders who led forces into Manchuria, crushing Japan's Kwantung Army formations during the short but massive August Storm operations in 1945. Few generals in World War II fought and won on both German and Japanese fronts. Number 19. Stanisław Maciek. Stanisław Maciek never had a homeland to return to, but he gave everything to fight for one. He wasn't a grand strategist or political player, he was a battlefield commander, a man whose armored units moved like liquid steel, fast, fluid, and absolutely unforgiving. And in a war full of tragedy for Poland, Maciek became a rare thing, a Polish general who never lost a battle. A veteran of World War I, the Polish-Soviet War, and the interwar cavalry reforms, Maciek understood mobility like few others. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, His motorized brigade gave one of the only coherent counterattacks during the collapse. When Poland fell, he didn't quit. He escaped, rebuilt, and fought on. By 1944, he was leading the Polish 1st Armored Division, a unit forged in exile and thrown into the battle under Canadian command during the Normandy campaign. What they did there was nothing short of tactical brilliance. At Falaise, Maciek's forces helped seal the pocket, cutting off the German retreat and smashing key elements of the Wehrmacht. His armor didn't just punch, it encircled, pinned, and destroyed. From Normandy, he pushed into Belgium and liberated key cities like Ypres and Ghent. Then came the Netherlands, where Maciek's division liberated Breda in a maneuver so precise, so disciplined, that it spared the city from destruction. His command style was aggressive but exact. Every movement was measured, every strike calculated, and his troops followed him with unshakable loyalty. Maciek's division crossed into Germany in 1945, continuing the drive until the very end. No setbacks, no defeats, just relentless pressure. He fought like a man who knew that, for Poland, this war was existential, and even in exile, he carried that weight into every battle plan. Politically, Maciek was caught in the cruel irony of victory. His homeland was handed to the Soviets, his citizenship was revoked, and while the Western Allies marched in parades, Maciek was left with nothing. No pension, no rank, no home. He ended up tending a bar in Scotland just to survive, while the men he led remembered him as one of the finest commanders of the war. Eventually, the recognition came, late but deserved. Restored rank, honors, a state funeral. But his real legacy isn't medals, it's the perfect battlefield record, the towns he freed, the soldiers who would have followed him anywhere. He may have lost his country, but he never lost a battle. Number 18, Robert Eichelberger. While Patton chased headlines in Europe and MacArthur soaked in the spotlight, Robert Eichelberger went to the places no one wanted and won. He didn't need glory, he needed results. And in the brutal, disease-ridden hellscapes of the Pacific, Eichelberger delivered victories the hard way, close quarters, under-resourced, and against an enemy that never surrendered. At the start of the war, he was superintendent of West Point, an administrative job far from the action. But when MacArthur needed someone to clean up the disaster at Buna, Eichelberger got the call. What he found there was a stalled campaign, shattered morale, and troops bogged down in jungle warfare. MacArthur gave him one job: take Buna or don't come back alive. Eichelberger didn't flinch. He went to the front himself, reorganized the entire operation under fire, and turned the tide. Buna fell, and with it, the myth that the Japanese forces were unbeatable in jungle terrain. That became his calling card. After Buna, Eichelberger led the 8th Army, carving a bloody path through New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and eventually into the Philippines. His campaigns were textbook island hopping, but on a massive scale. He mastered logistics across thousands of miles, coordinated air, sea, and land assaults, and still kept his forces tight, mobile, and lethal. At Leyte, Luzon, and Mindanao, his army crushed Japanese resistance and liberated millions. Unlike some of his peers, Eichelberger led from the front, helmet on, rifle in hand if necessary, checking on foxholes and forward units, pushing exhausted soldiers to dig deep because he was digging with them. He wasn't theatrical, he was there. Eichelberger was sharp, flexible, and practical. He learned how to fight in terrain that chewed up men and machinery alike. He emphasized training, morale, and preparation, traits that kept his troops alive and effective even in some of the most hostile environments of the war. He didn't experiment with flashy doctrine, he didn't need to. He focused on what worked and got it done. Eichelberger was a soldier's general and a strategist's general. Dependable, effective, and quietly brilliant. He never broke ranks with his superiors, even when it meant staying out of the limelight. But inside the Pacific Theater, everyone knew when the job was dirty, bloody, and critical, you sent in Eichelberger. His legacy today is underappreciated, mostly because he wasn't chasing cameras or writing dramatic memoirs. But among those who've studied the Pacific Campaign closely, his name carries real weight. In an unforgiving theater, he made the impossible look like routine. Robert Eichelberger didn't ask for fame. He asked, "What's the objective?" and then took it. Number 17, Omar Bradley. When it came to commanding massive, multinational forces across Europe, General Omar Bradley was the guy Eisenhower trusted most. A West Point graduate and Eisenhower's classmate, Bradley rose through the ranks without scandal, ego, or drama. He was calm, calculating, and famously unpretentious, earning him the nickname the GI's General for his easy manner and concern for the troops under his command. His combat debut came in North Africa in 1943, where he served under Patton during the Tunisia campaign. While Patton brought discipline and firepower to the Second Corps after the Kasserine disaster, it was Bradley who refined its structure and led it through the final stages of the campaign. After Tunisia, Eisenhower put him in charge of US forces in Sicily, where he again served under Patton, but with growing independence and influence. But it was in Normandy that Bradley truly stepped into the spotlight. As the commander of US First Army during the D-Day invasion, Bradley was responsible for Omaha and Utah beaches. His troops bore the brunt of the fiercest fighting on June 6, especially at Omaha, where American forces were nearly pushed back into the sea. But Bradley didn't blink. He adapted, adjusted fire support, and pushed his units inland. Over the next few weeks, he oversaw the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy, navigating some of the toughest terrain and most stubborn German resistance of the campaign. In July 1944, Bradley was promoted to command the newly formed 12th Army Group, which would grow into the largest US field command ever assembled, ultimately overseeing more than 1.3 million men across 4 armies: the 1st, 3rd, 9th, and 15th. Under his leadership, the Americans broke out of Normandy during Operation Cobra, with Patton's 3rd Army pouring through the gap and racing across France. Bradley coordinated the logistics, synchronized the advances, and managed the personalities. No easy feats when those personalities included George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery. His forces liberated Paris, crossed the Rhine, and surged toward Germany. During the Battle of the Bulge, Bradley's forces were caught off guard, but he swiftly regrouped, reinforced the line, and contained the German offensive. He authorized Patton's dramatic pivot to relieve Bastogne and played a central role in stabilizing the front. By spring 1945, Bradley's army group was tearing through the German heartland, crossing the Rhine, capturing cities like Cologne, and linking up with Soviet forces deep in Germany. After the war, Bradley became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, helped oversee the reorganization of the US military, and played a key role in building NATO's early structure. He was promoted to General of the Army, 5-star, one of only a handful of men to earn that rank. Bradley never became a pop culture icon like Patton, but among military historians and officers, he's remembered as one of the most competent American generals of the 20th centuries. Not for speeches or spectacle, but for getting the job done, quietly and thoroughly. Number 16, Albert Kesselring. When the Allies looked south toward Rome, they knew who was waiting. Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe Field Marshal turned commander of German forces in Italy. Not the most famous general of the war, but one of the most tenacious. Kesselring didn't come up through the army like most other senior commanders. He was originally an artillery officer in World War I, but transferred to the Luftwaffe in the 1930s and rose rapidly through its ranks. By the early stages of World War II, he was already commanding major air operations in Poland, France, and during the Battle of Britain. But his most defining role came not in the skies, but in the mountains of Italy. Appointed Commander-in-Chief South in late 1943, Kesselring took over Germany's defense of Italy just as the Allies were landing at Salerno. From then until 1945, he directed one of the most impressive strategic delays of the war, holding off a numerically and materially superior Allied force across some of the roughest terrain in Europe for nearly 18 months. Kesselring's hallmark was his ability to maximize terrain, fortify natural barriers, and slow down enemy offensives without bleeding his forces dry. His defensive lines, the Gustav Line, the Winter Line, the Arno Line, and finally the Gothic Line, became nightmares for the advancing allies. From Monte Cassino to the Liri Valley, from Anzio to the Apennines, Kesselring fought a war of delay, counterattack, and elastic defense that confounded even seasoned commanders like Alexander and Clark. Despite commanding second-tier units and receiving minimal reinforcements, Italy was always a lower priority for Berlin. Kesselring managed to hold central Italy for well over a year, even retaking ground after setbacks. His counterstrike after the Allied Anzio landings nearly pushed the beachhead back into the sea. Only heavy Allied reinforcements prevented a disaster. His battlefield performance was undeniably impressive. He wasn't orchestrating blitzkriegs, he was holding the line, repeatedly against larger and better equipped forces. He lost territory, but only after exacting heavy costs, and often on his own terms. When Rome fell in June of 1944, it wasn't due to collapse, it was a controlled withdrawal to stronger positions. Kesselring's forces then regrouped on the Gothic Line and held out until the final months of the war. But he couldn't pull off the same miracle in the West that he had in Italy. By then, the Wehrmacht was collapsing and the Allies were rolling through the Rhineland. Kesselring's role in 1945 was more symbolic than strategic. He's often recognized as one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, especially in secondary theaters. Even his enemies respected him. After the war, British generals like Harold Alexander acknowledged Kesselring's skill and professionalism. Today, Kesselring's military reputation remains high. His campaigns in Italy are still studied for their operational complexity, terrain exploitation, and economy of force. But his legacy is permanently shadowed by the brutal occupation policies carried out under his watch. Number 15. Alexander Wasilewski. Where others led from the front, Wasilewski commanded from the center. As chief of the general staff, he was Stalin's primary military strategist for much of the war. He helped orchestrate the Red Army's transformation from a battered, retreating force in 1941 into the war-crushing juggernaut that rolled into Berlin and Manchuria by 1945. His fingerprints are all over the Eastern Front's turning points. In Stalingrad, he helped coordinate Operation Uranus, the brilliant double envelopment that trapped and destroyed the German Sixth Army. Alongside Zhukov, Wasilewski ensured that multiple Soviet fronts moved in concert, a staggering logistical and operational achievement, and a death blow to Germany's momentum in the East. But that was just the start. In 1943, Wasilewski played a leading role in the Soviet response to Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive at Kursk. He helped prepare the defensive belt that absorbed the German attack, then flipped the script with a Soviet counteroffensive that drove the Wehrmacht west and shattered their armored strength. By 1944, he wasn't just planning operations, he was leading them. As commander of the 3rd Belarusian Front, Wasilewski directed the northern pincer of Operation Bagration, the massive summer assault that obliterated Army Group Center and liberated most of Belarus. It was one of the most devastating campaigns of the entire war, and he executed it with clinical precision. Then, as the war in Europe wound down, Wasilewski was tapped for one final task: the Soviet offensive against Japan. In August 1945, he directed the Manchurian strategic offensive, crushing Japan's elite Kwantung army in a matter of days. It was a masterclass in surprise, coordination, and mechanized warfare across brutal terrain, and it showed that Soviet operational skill wasn't limited to the European theater. What set Wasilewski apart was his ability to synchronize massive operations across multiple fronts. He wasn't a flashy battlefield commander, but he had the trust of Stalin, something few could claim for long, and he earned it through results, not bravado. He was a consensus builder among Soviet generals, known for clear thinking, calm demeanor, and the rare ability to manage egos and coordinate cooperation at the highest levels. He also stood apart for his professionalism. Even in the paranoid environment of Stalin's war cabinet, Vasilevsky avoided politics and focused on the war. That focus helped make the Soviet war effort more coherent and far more lethal after the chaos of 1941. He was made a two-time hero of the Soviet Union, served as Minister of Defense, and was one of only a handful of men promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union during the war. In military circles, he's remembered as the Red Army's strategic brain, less visible than Zhukov, but no less vital. His name may not be as globally famous, but inside every major Soviet victory from Stalingrad to Berlin to Manchuria, Vasilevsky was at the center of the map. Number 14, Vasily Chuikov. There are generals who win with maneuvers. There are generals who win with firepower. Vasily Chuikov won with grit, grenades, and a city reduced to rubble. Best known as the defender of Stalingrad, Chuikov commanded the 62nd Army, tasked with holding the city at all costs. And he did, through dust, blood, and the closest quarters combat of the entire war. If Zhukov broke the Wehrmacht, Chuikov broke its spirit. When Chuikov arrived at Stalingrad in September 1942, the situation was already desperate. German forces had stormed into the city, driving Soviet defenders back toward the Volga River. Chuikov set up headquarters in a bunker near the front lines, sometimes just 100 meters from German troops, and declared that his army would hold the city block by block, building by building. No more retreats, no more open fields. Urban warfare was the new terrain, and Chuikov mastered it. His tactics were brutal but effective. He pioneered what came to be known as hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet troops so close to the Germans that air and artillery support became nearly impossible without hitting their own men. This forced the Wehrmacht into exhausting face-to-face combat in ruined factories and apartments. Machine guns at stairwells, snipers in shattered buildings, flamethrowers in the sewers. Stalingrad wasn't a battle, it was a grindhouse, and Chuikov made it that way on purpose. His leadership was fearless. He personally toured the front, issued strict anti-retreat orders, and kept morale up in impossible conditions. He was blunt, aggressive, and occasionally cruel, but his men knew he was suffering the same danger they were. When Soviet counteroffensives encircled the German Sixth Army, it was Chuikov's exhausted forces that finished the job, storming the final German strongholds in January and February of 1943. When Friedrich Paulus surrendered, it was to Chuikov. Stalingrad was one of the most important victories of the war, and he held the line under impossible odds. He later commanded the 8th Guards Army, leading it through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany. His troops were among the first to cross the Oder and were given the vanguard of the Berlin assault in 1945. In fact, it was Chuikov who accepted the German surrender of Berlin on May 2nd, 1945. From the cellars of Stalingrad to the ruins of Hitler's capital, his battlefield arc was nothing short of mythic. His approach at Stalingrad became the model for Soviet close-quarters city fighting. Decentralized squads, high mobility within buildings, sniper teams, flamethrower shock troops, and strict command discipline. His use of hugging tactics forced the Germans to fight on Soviet terms, neutralizing their air and artillery support. Chuikov's legacy is carved into the concrete of Stalingrad. He became the city's patron general, its battlefield icon. In Russia, he's revered as the general who stood up when standing seemed impossible. His tomb is literally located at the Mamayev Kurgan Memorial Complex, overlooking the Volga, the same ground he refused to give up in 1942. That image of a general who fought in the dirt, bled with his men, and came back to bury the Reich in Berlin has made Chuikov a legend. Number 13, Bernard Montgomery. To his troops, he was Monty. To his allies, he was sometimes a headache. But to the British Army and the outcome of World War II, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was absolutely essential. Montgomery took over 8th Army in North Africa at a critical low point in mid-1942. British forces had been driven back repeatedly by Rommel and morale was shaky. Monty's first move? Reinforce discipline, simplify the plan, and promise his troops something they hadn't heard in a while: victory. At El Alamein, he delivered. After months of preparation, he launched a massive, grinding offensive in October 1942 that finally broke the Axis hold on Egypt. El Alamein was the turning point in North Africa and Montgomery's first major win. He pushed Rommel west across Libya and into Tunisia, helping set the stage for the Axis surrender there in May 1943. Next came Sicily, where Montgomery co-led the Allied landings alongside Patton, though the relationship was anything but smooth. The two clashed constantly over strategy, credit, and even media coverage. Monty's methodical pace frustrated American commanders, but this approach kept British losses relatively low. The island was eventually secured and the Allies moved on to the Italian mainland. Montgomery's biggest assignment came in 1944, commanding the 21st Army Group during the Normandy invasion. On D-Day, Monty's forces landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, pushing inland toward Caen. Progress was slower than hoped, especially in Caen, but Montgomery held firm, absorbing German counterattacks while American forces broke through in the west. The result was a coordinated Allied push across France, with Monty's forces advancing through Belgium and into the Netherlands. His most ambitious move came in September 1944 with Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne assault to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands and punch into northern Germany. The operation fell short. The Allies captured several bridges but failed to hold Arnhem, the final link in the chain. The plan was daring, but the execution was flawed, and the failure to seize the last bridge delayed the Allied timetable. Despite that setback, Montgomery played a key role in the Battle of the Bulge, deploying British forces quickly to reinforce the northern shoulder of the front and help stabilize the Allied line. In early 1945, he led the crossing of the Rhine River and the final push into northern Germany. By May, his armies had linked up with the Soviets and helped end the war in Europe. Montgomery was never a reckless commander. He emphasized preparation, overwhelming force, and minimizing casualties. Critics called him slow and self-promoting, but his soldiers appreciated the fact that he didn't waste lives. His insistence on detailed planning paid off in operations like El Alamein and the Rhine crossing, where set-piece battles turned in the Allies' favor. He wasn't an innovator in the mold of Patton or Guderian. Monty didn't revolutionize warfare, but he mastered the fundamentals: logistics, coordination, and battlefield timing. His doctrine was based on method over momentum, and while that sometimes caused friction with more aggressive commanders, it also helped avoid unnecessary disasters. Few could argue with his record. Montgomery's troops consistently delivered under pressure, and his leadership helped shape the final Allied victory in the West. His legacy remains complex but respected. In Britain, Montgomery became a national hero. His victory at El Alamein was immortalized as one of the great turning points of the war. He was praised for his care for the men under his command and his refusal to be rushed into battles he wasn't ready for. At the same time, his ego and relentless self-promotion earned him lasting criticism, especially among Allied peers. But whatever judgments on style, Montgomery helped win the war in Western Europe. His campaigns, cautious or not, wore down one of history's most dangerous militaries and drove them back across the continent. Number 12. Ivan Konev. A marshal of the Soviet Union and one of the Red Army's most trusted commanders, Konev played a lead role in nearly every major Soviet offensive from 1943 onward. He wasn't always subtle, but he was lethal, loyal, and unshakably effective. Konev first came to prominence in 1941 and 42 when he led forces in Ukraine during the grim early months of the war. His early performance was uneven. He commanded the southwestern front during the disastrous defense of Kharkov and faced near relief after encirclement mounted. But instead of sidelining him, Stalin gave him another shot, and that's when Konev began to shine. By 1943, he was leading the Steppe Front, one of the main Soviet formations in the Battle of Kursk. After the German offensive was blunted, Konev's forces joined the massive counterattack that drove the Wehrmacht west. From that point on, he was on a tear. In 1944, Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front, launching one offensive after another. Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, where he helped encircle tens of thousands of German troops, the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive, which liberated western Ukraine and opened the door to Poland, and then the crown jewel, Operation Bagration. While Zhukov and Rokossovsky were hammering Army Group Center from the north, Konev's First Ukrainian Front drove into southern Poland, smashing German defenses and securing critical bridgeheads across the Vistula River. His operations were fast, brutal, and highly coordinated. In 1945, Konev took center stage again. His forces spearheaded the Vistula-Oder offensive, a staggering 300-mile push that brought Soviet troops to the gates of Berlin in just weeks. He moved so fast that Stalin had to slow him down, not out of concern for the Germans, but to coordinate the final assault on Berlin itself. When the time came, Stalin gave both Zhukov and Konev competing sectors around Berlin, essentially turning the final battle into a race. Konev's forces stormed across the Neisse River, smashed through Silesia, and took Dresden, Leipzig, and finally pushed into Czechoslovakia, taking over Prague in May 1945. While Zhukov got the iconic moment of raising the red flag over the Reichstag, Konev's advance was every bit as decisive. Konev was ferocious. He favored deep thrusts, fast encirclements, and massive artillery barrages. Classic Soviet doctrine executed with ruthless precision. His ability to maintain tempo across huge distances made him one of Stalin's most relied upon commanders in the final stretch of the war. His campaigns featured some of the best executed deep operations of the war, with tank armies exploiting breakthroughs, infantry locking down enemy flanks, and artillery paving the way. His use of deception and operational flexibility in the lead-up to Vistula-Oder was a standout example of Soviet adaptability. Konev's legacy is significant, if slightly overshadowed by Zhukov's fame. In Russia, he's remembered as one of the architects of victory, a marshal whose name is attached to some of the Red Army's greatest offensives. His post-war image is more controversial in places like Eastern Europe, particularly due to his role in Hungary, but within Soviet military history, his stature remains high. Number 11. Tomoyuki Yamashita. In the early days of the Pacific War, when Japan's momentum seemed unstoppable, one name surged to prominence with startling speed: General Tomoyuki Yamashita. In just 10 weeks, with a force of roughly 30,000 troops, Yamashita swept down the Malayan Peninsula, dismantling a British-led army more than twice his size. His campaign, marked by speed, deception, and daring maneuver, culminated in the fall of Singapore, the linchpin of British power in Southeast Asia. On February 15, 1942, over 80,000 Allied soldiers surrendered, the largest capitulation in British military history. Yamashita outflanked stronger positions, moved troops swiftly along jungle tracks and on bicycles, and leveraged minimal air and armor support to devastating effect. He pressed forward even with stretched supply lines and low ammunition, ultimately bluffing the British into surrender at a moment when his own resources were near breaking. It worked. The British collapsed, and Yamashita became a hero at home, and a symbol of Allied failure abroad. He was later tasked with defending the Philippines against the coming American invasion. By then, Japan's position was crumbling. Yamashita had few resources, minimal reinforcements, and no realistic chance of victory. Still, he mounted a defense that defied expectations. Rather than waste his forces in a doomed stand at the beaches, he withdrew into the mountainous interior of northern Luzon, organizing a defense meant to stretch American logistics and buy time. It worked. While Manila fell in early 1945, the rest of northern Luzon became a grinding campaign that lasted until Japan's surrender. American generals, including MacArthur, expected a swift fight. Yamashita forced a months-long slugfest through treacherous terrain. His defense of the Philippines showed a different side of his generalship: patient, defensive, adaptive. While the war was already lost, Yamashita held out until the very end, commanding what was left of the Japanese 14th Area Army from remote jungle headquarters, still organized, still resisting. His Malaya campaign is still studied as a masterclass in operational warfare, rapid movement, psychological pressure, and logistical improvisation in harsh terrain. Even Allied commanders acknowledged his ability. MacArthur, no easy man to impress, called him a formidable opponent. Number 10. Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a war defined by clashing armies and towering personalities, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood at the center, the one who held the entire Allied war effort together. By the time the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944, Eisenhower had already managed one of the most complex military coalitions in history. He was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, responsible not only for planning D-Day, but for directing the entire Western Allied campaign across France and into Germany. Eisenhower's military rise was meteoric. Before the war, he was largely unknown, a staff officer with no combat command experience. But his organizational talent and strategic vision caught the eye of General George Marshall, who appointed him to increasingly critical roles. In 1942, Eisenhower was put in charge of Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. From there, he oversaw the invasions of Sicily and Italy, and then was handed the biggest job of all, planning and commanding Operation Overlord. D-Day was his defining moment. Eisenhower coordinated the land, sea, and air forces of multiple nations in a single, synchronized assault across the English Channel. He made the call to go on June 6 despite uncertain weather, an enormous risk. The landings succeeded, and with them, the liberation of Western Europe began. From that point on, Eisenhower managed the broad front strategy, pushing Allied armies across France, through the Low Countries, and into the heart of Germany. He wasn't a tactical micromanager. His job was to keep the alliance together, focus resources, and ensure the overall campaign stayed coordinated. And in that, he succeeded where few others could have. Was he a battlefield general in the style of Patton or Rommel? No. But his strategic judgment proved sound. He supported the breakout from Normandy, held firm during the Battle of the Bulge, and managed the final drive into Germany with a ruthless clarity. When political tensions flared between British and American commanders, or between the Western Allies and the Soviets, Eisenhower was the one who smoothed them over and kept the focus on victory. His ability to coordinate joint and combined operations on a massive scale was mind-blowing. He managed land, air, and naval forces from multiple nations across multiple fronts, which required a level of integration and cooperation rarely seen before. His logistical planning was vast, complex, and most importantly, effective. He's remembered not just as the general who led the Allies to victory in Western Europe, but as a symbol of calm, competent leadership in an era of global crisis. In a war of rivalries and chaos, Eisenhower kept the Allied machine running and pointed it in the right direction. Number 9. Douglas MacArthur. Few generals in World War II had a trajectory as dramatic or as polarizing as Douglas MacArthur. At the war's outbreak, MacArthur faced a devastating blow. In late 1941, Japanese forces overran much of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, where MacArthur was commander of US and Filipino troops. As Japanese troops pushed toward Manila, MacArthur withdrew to Bataan and Corregidor, where Allied resistance held out for months under siege. But in March 1942, under orders from Washington, he evacuated to Australia, leaving behind forces that would eventually surrender. The retreat drew sharp criticism. His parting words, "I shall return," drew even more attention. And return he did. From 1943 onward, as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur directed a complex, multinational advance through New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and eventually back into the Philippines. His forces bypassed major Japanese strongholds, like Rabaul, and instead seized key positions, cutting enemy supply lines and isolating large garrisons without costly assaults. The approach, coordinated with Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive, was methodical and effective. MacArthur's biggest moment came in October 1944, when American troops stormed the beaches of Leyte. He waded ashore with cameras rolling, fulfilling his pledge and beginning the reconquest of the archipelago. Over the next several months, US and Filipino forces under his command battled fiercely to reclaim Luzon, retake Manila, and dismantle Japan's Southern Army groups. His campaigns were not without friction. He clashed frequently with naval commanders, especially over priorities and resources, but he got results. The campaign across the Southwest Pacific was long, complex, and fought in brutal terrain, and under MacArthur, it steadily moved forward. MacArthur favored maneuver over attrition. He often sought to outflank strongholds rather than storm them, relying on surprise landings and joint operations to keep pressure on Japan's overstretched forces. The Hollandia landings in 1944, for example, bypassed Japanese defenses entirely and accelerated the Allied push toward the Philippines. He inspired loyalty, but also drew criticism for his ego and disregard for joint command norms. Still, his battlefield performance, after early setbacks, were consistently effective. His campaigns were complex, multi-branch operations conducted across vast distances, and they delivered results. His legacy remains powerful. Revered by some, debated by others, MacArthur stands as one of the most consequential American generals of the 20th century, not just for how he fought, but for what came after. Number 8. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. He was a monarchist in a republic, a former Russian general defending Finland from Russia, and a man who never wanted war, yet found himself leading his country through two of them. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim wasn't a career politician or even a traditional field general, but when Finland's survival was on the line, he delivered. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939, the Red Army expected a quick and easy victory. Instead, they ran headfirst into the Mannerheim Line, a series of fortifications strung across the Karelian Isthmus, and into the bitter determination of a vastly outnumbered Finnish army under Mannerheim's command. In the Winter War, Mannerheim led roughly 300,000 Finnish troops against over 1 million Soviet soldiers. The Finns had almost no armor, little artillery, and an air force dwarfed by the Soviet VVS. But what they did have was terrain, tactical ingenuity, and Mannerheim's steady leadership. His troops used the forests and snow to deadly effect, launching hit-and-run attacks, cutting Soviet columns into pieces, and forcing costly frontal assaults on frozen fortifications. Though Finland eventually signed a peace treaty in March 1940, ceding territory to the USSR, the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses. Mannerheim had preserved Finland's independence and shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility. In 1941, with Germany invading the Soviet Union, Finland entered the war again, this time as a co-belligerent with Nazi Germany in the Continuation War. Mannerheim's objective wasn't conquest, it was to regain lost territory and defend Finnish sovereignty. He kept Finnish forces focused on the Karelian front, refusing German requests to attack Leningrad directly. As the war turned against the Axis, Mannerheim pulled Finland out of the conflict. In 1944, as Soviet forces launched a massive offensive, he again took command and managed to halt the Red Army at Tali-Ihantala, the largest battle in Nordic history. It was a staggering effort that helped secure a negotiated peace in September 1944. That peace came at a cost. Finland gave up more territory and agreed to expel remaining German troops, leading to the brief Lapland War. But once again, Finland survived. Mannerheim had navigated between giants, fought 2 wars against a superpower and preserved his nation's independence without turning it into a puppet state of either side. Mannerheim was cautious, calculated, and focused entirely on national defense. He wasn't chasing grand offensives or glory, he was holding the line, buying time, and keeping Finland intact. He empowered one of the most adaptive fighting forces of the war. Finnish troops excelled at small unit tactics, mobility in harsh weather, and exploiting terrain, methods refined under his watch. The use of ski troops, ambush tactics, and forest warfare became defining features of the Finnish defense. Mannerheim is widely regarded as the father of modern Finnish independence. His leadership during the Winter War and Continuation War earned him respect not only at home, but even among his adversaries. He's remembered as a symbol of resistance, pragmatism, and national survival. Karl Mannerheim did what so many bigger generals unfortunately couldn't: protect his country against impossible odds and walk away with its sovereignty intact. Number 7. Erich von Manstein. Erich von Manstein didn't need theatrics. His brilliance unfolded on maps, in flanking maneuvers, and in victories that defied odds. He was the architect of the Ardennes Plan, the bold strike through France's least defended sector that caught the Allies off guard and ended a major war front in 6 weeks. Though a staff officer at the time, it was his idea that changed the entire course of the campaign. In the east, Manstein earned his reputation on the ground. Leading the 11th Army, he took Sevastopol in 1942, one of the most fortified positions on the continent. That victory alone was enough to earn him the Field Marshal's baton. But his most famous moment came in early 1943, after the collapse at Stalingrad. Soviet forces had pushed deep into southern Russia. Manstein, now in command of Army Group South, pulled together mobile reserves and counterattacked at Kharkov. Against a larger force in winter conditions, he executed a near-perfect counterstroke, surrounding and destroying multiple Soviet armies. The front, which looked on the verge of collapse, was restored in weeks. That operation, known as the Third Battle of Kharkov, is still studied in military academies around the world as a masterclass in mobile warfare and operational timing. He brought that same calculated aggression to the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, commanding the southern wing of the German offensive. His forces made the deepest advances of the campaign, but the attack was called off just as he believed Soviet defenses were beginning to crack. After that, the war turned against Germany. But Manstein's withdrawals through Ukraine in late 1943 and early 1944 were models of delaying action under pressure. Even in retreat, he inflicted heavy losses and slowed the Red Army's advance. He was an operational artist. He understood how to shape campaigns, not just win battles. His strength was flexibility, shifting armored forces quickly across wide fronts, exploiting overextensions, and seeing windows of opportunity where others saw chaos. His concept of the backhand blow, letting the enemy advance, then striking hard at the flank, was an innovative form of counterattack that required confidence, timing, and complete control. His post-war memoir, Lost Victories, helped shape the image of the professional German general, brilliant in war, apolitical in posture, and often at odds with the Nazi regime. While that narrative deserves scrutiny, Manstein's military record holds up. He's consistently ranked among Germany's greatest generals, arguably its most capable operational commander of the war. Number 6. Konstantin Rokossovsky. Among the titans of the Eastern Front, Konstantin Rokossovsky stands out not just for bombast or brutality, but for precision, adaptability, and a calm mastery of warfare at its largest scale. He was there when the tide first began to turn. In 1941, commanding the 16th Army, Rokossovsky helped halt the German advance on Moscow, reinforcing battered lines and organizing counterattacks under brutal conditions. At Stalingrad, he commanded the Don Front, one of the key forces in Operation Uranus, the double envelopment that crushed the German 6th Army. In 1943, his central front played a leading role in Kursk, absorbing the weight of German attacks before transitioning seamlessly into a counteroffensive that drove the Wehrmacht back. Then came Operation Bagration, arguably the most devastating Soviet campaign of the war. Rokossovsky proposed something unconventional. Instead of a single breakthrough, he wanted two. Stalin wasn't thrilled. Soviet doctrine favored concentration, not division. But Rokossovsky stood his ground, respectfully but firmly. Incredibly, Stalin agreed. The results? A complete dismantling of Army Group Center. German forces were encircled, annihilated, or forced into disorganized retreat. Belarus was liberated, and the path to Poland was blown wide open. It was one of the most effective operations of the entire war, and Rokossovsky had planned every step. What made him exceptional wasn't just the scale of his victories, it was how consistently he delivered them. From defensive stands to high-speed advances, from urban warfare to sweeping flanking maneuvers, Rokossovsky's campaigns rarely faltered. His ability to balance doctrine with battlefield reality gave him an edge over more rigid commanders, and his coordination of artillery, armor, and infantry showed a deep grasp of combined arms warfare. He understood how to make Soviet doctrine work. He adapted when conditions demanded it, and he wasn't afraid to push back when he believed a different approach was needed. That kind of quiet defiance, especially in Stalin's USSR, was rare. That he survived it was even rarer. Today, he's remembered as one of the Red Army's finest generals, second perhaps only to Zhukov, but in many ways his equal in skill. His memoirs are widely respected for their clarity and honesty, and within military history circles, his name stands as a benchmark for calm, methodical, and effective command. Rokossovsky didn't seek the spotlight, he earned it. Number 5. William Slim. In the shadow of Europe's headlines and North Africa's fame, the jungles of Burma were nearly invisible to the public. But there, fighting a brutal war against a fanatical enemy in some of the harshest terrain on Earth, General William Slim turned a shattered force into one of the most effective Allied armies of World War II. When Slim first arrived in the theater, the picture was grim. The Japanese had swept through Burma in 1942, and Allied forces had retreated in chaos. Disease, disorganization, and demoralization plagued the British Indian units left behind. Slim took command of what many considered a dead-end front, and then quietly changed everything. He rebuilt the 14th Army from the ground up, retraining troops for jungle combat, emphasizing fitness, discipline, and confidence. Slim knew morale mattered as much as firepower, and he worked to convince his men, not just through orders, but through example, that the Japanese could be beaten. In 1944, that belief was put to the test. Japanese forces launched a massive offensive into India, aiming to break Allied lines and capture key territory. At Imphal and Kohima, his army stood firm. Supplied entirely by air, his troops held out through months of siege, outlasting and outmaneuvering a larger Japanese force. When the rains cleared, it was the Japanese who broke. Slim didn't stop there. He pushed south, launching a textbook campaign to recapture Burma. In 1945, his army crossed rivers, outflanked strongpoints, and bypassed terrain that seemed impassable. His capture of Meiktila and Mandalay shattered Japanese cohesion. Rangoon fell soon after. What had begun as a retreat ended in total victory. He used air supply at scale, coordinated multinational units seamlessly, and executed deception plans that kept his enemies guessing. He made jungle warfare work, something few Allied commanders could claim. Over time, a recognition caught up. His peers came to regard him as Britain's finest general of the war. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, became a classic of military leadership, praised for its clarity, humility, and insight. Professional soldiers cite Slim as the model of a quiet, effective leader, thoughtful, unshakable, and respected by everyone who served under him. He won his war in silence, but he won it completely. Number 4. Heinz Guderian. Heinz Guderian was the mind behind Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine, the architect of a new kind of war built on speed, coordination, and concentrated force. He figured out how to use tanks like no one else had. not as support units, but as the spearhead. His vision of mobile, combined arms warfare reshaped the battlefield, and in the opening years of World War II, it delivered devastating results. In Poland, Guderian's 19th Corps led the rapid thrusts that shattered resistance and captured key crossings in days. In France, he broke through at Sedan, then pushed his tanks forward with such relentless pace that even his superiors tried to rein him in. By the time they caught up, Guderian's panzers had reached the Channel, splitting Allied forces in two and sealing France's fate in just 6 weeks. His command style was aggressive, forward-leaning, and often personally directed. He led from the front, radio in hand, moving with the spearhead. Barbarossa, the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, was his next proving ground. Commanding Panzer Group 2, Guderian drove deep into Soviet territory, helping encircle entire Red Army formations at Smolensk. His advance brought German tanks within sight of Moscow by autumn, but that was the high watermark. Strategic decisions beyond his control, like the diversion to Kiev and Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals, blunted his momentum. When Guderian pulled back to avoid collapse, Hitler fired him. For the rest of the war, Guderian's role shifted. He became an advisor, then Inspector General of Armored Troops, and finally Chief of the General Staff in the chaotic final year. He tried to reform tank production, improve Germany's mobile defenses, and resist some of Hitler's more disastrous orders, but by then, the damage was done, and the Wehrmacht was in retreat. Guderian's ideas became the foundation for post-war armored doctrine worldwide. His emphasis on coordination, tempo, and decisive thrusts shaped how modern militaries think about mechanized warfare. NATO and Soviet doctrine alike borrowed from his playbook. His book, Achtung, Panzer, became required reading in military academies. The term Blitzkrieg itself is inseparable from his legacy. Number 3. Erwin Rommel. When people think of German generals in World War II, one name always comes to mind: Erwin Rommel. Daring, mobile, and charismatic, he became the face of the Axis war effort in North Africa, and for many, the image of the honorable enemy. Rommel first made his name in 1940 during the invasion of France, leading a panzer division with speed and aggression. But it was North Africa where his legend was truly forged. In early 1941, sent to shore up collapsing Italian positions in Libya, Rommel took command of the Africa Corps and launched a series of bold, unexpected offensives. What was supposed to be a limited defensive mission turned into a fast-moving desert campaign that stunned British forces. With limited resources, Rommel played the battlefield like a chessboard, outmaneuvering larger forces, striking weak points, and constantly shifting position to maintain the initiative. He captured Tobruk, pushed into Egypt, and brought Axis forces to within striking distance of the Suez Canal. But Rommel's success came at a cost. His supply lines were fragile, his logistics often improvised, and his momentum increasingly dependent on fuel and reinforcements that never came in sufficient quantity. At El Alamein in late 1942, British forces under Montgomery dug in and finally halted Rommel's advance. Outnumbered and outgunned, he was forced to retreat west. It was the turning point of the Desert War. In 1944, Rommel was reassigned to the Western Front, tasked with preparing Germany's coastal defenses ahead of the anticipated Allied invasion. In France, he took a pragmatic approach, reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, positioning troops closer to the beaches, and pushing for a more flexible response to any landings. His proposals clashed with high command, and ultimately, his predictions were proven right. When D-Day came, German response was slow, fractured, and unable to contain the Allies. Rommel was wounded in July 1944 when his car was strafed by Allied aircraft. Not long after, he was implicated, falsely or ambiguously, in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Given the choice between a show trial and suicide, Rommel took poison in October 1944. His death was covered up by the regime and framed as a hero's passing. Strategically, Rommel was a master of the operational level. His style was based on tempo, surprise, and rapid exploitation, but it sometimes came at the expense of coordination or long-term planning. In North Africa, his brilliance on the battlefield couldn't overcome Germany's strategic neglect of the theater. In Normandy, his warnings went unheeded until it was too late. In the post-war West, Rommel was recast as the good German, an honorable soldier who fought cleanly, respected the enemy, and resisted extremism. That image has its flaws and omissions, but it's endured. He's remembered not just for tactical brilliance, but as a figure who stood apart from the more brutal elements of the Nazi war machine. His name became a staple of military history, his campaigns studied in detail, and his persona mythologized in books, films, and war colleges around the world. Rommel lost the war, but he won a kind of lasting respect, even from his adversaries. Number 2. George S. Patton. No general moved faster, no general hit harder, and no general left a stronger impression on his allies, his enemies, or his own troops than George S. Patton. From North Africa to the heart of Germany, Patton was the US Army's most dynamic field commander. He defeated his enemies with speed, precision, and momentum they couldn't match. Wherever Patton's tanks went, the front lines shifted fast. His rise began in 1943, taking over the battered Second Corps after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. Morale was low, performance was worse. Patton turned it around almost overnight, tightened discipline, restored confidence, and led the Corps to victory at El Guter. That set the tone: aggressive leadership, tight control, and relentless pressure. In Sicily, he commanded the 7th Army and delivered results again, dashing across the island, capturing Palermo, then racing to Messina ahead of the British. It wasn't always by the book, and he disobeyed orders more than once, but the campaign ended with Axis forces driven out and Patton's reputation as a bold field commander firmly established. After a brief exile over the infamous slapping incident, Patton returned in time for the breakout from Normandy. With the 3rd Army under his command, he launched one of the most remarkable campaigns of the war, charging across France, liberating city after city, cutting through German defenses like a scalpel. Fuel shortages, not German resistance, were what slowed him down. In December 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Patton didn't flinch. He pivoted his entire army 90 degrees in brutal winter conditions and drove north to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne in Bastogne. It blunted the German advance and helped turn the tide of the battle. By war's end, Patton's forces had crossed the Rhine, rolled into southern Germany, and entered Czechoslovakia. Wherever he went, the enemy retreated or surrendered. Patton understood mobility better than almost anyone. How to keep pressure on, how to exploit gaps, how to break an army's will to fight. His coordination with air support, his aggressive use of reconnaissance, and his emphasis on empowering subordinates made his formations flexible, fast, and deadly. He demanded discipline, embraced symbolism, and gave speeches that could whip an army into a frenzy. But beneath the bravado was a tactician who understood how to win campaigns and how to keep winning them. He's the archetype of the hard-charging general, fierce, uncompromising, and larger than life. His campaigns are studied, his quotes are engraved, and the image, helmet, sunglasses, revolvers, is iconic. In the mythology of World War II, he's the warrior America remembers. Number 1. Georgy Zhukov. In the darkest hour of the Eastern Front, with German panzers closing in on Moscow and the Red Army reeling, one name echoed through Stalin's inner circle: Zhukov. Zhukov took command when failure meant the fall of the Soviet Union. In December 1941, with the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, he halted the advance, then drove them back through snow and steel in a winter counteroffensive that shattered the myth of German invincibility. At Stalingrad, he launched Operation Uranus, a textbook double envelopment, executed on a scale the world had never seen. Entire German armies vanished inside that frozen trap. Then came Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. Minefields, anti-tank guns, layered defenses stretching for miles. His counterattack then crushed Hitler's last major gamble in the east. And when the Red Army rolled west, it didn't stop. Operation Bagration tore through German lines like wildfire, an annihilation so complete it left Berlin exposed. Zhukov took the city with brutal, relentless force. Zhukov wasn't a theorist. He didn't invent new doctrines. What he mastered was scale, the coordination of entire fronts, the timing of massive offensives, the brutal calculus of attrition. He listened to his subordinates, learned from early disasters, and reshaped the Red Army into a war-winning machine. In the halls of power, Zhukov's presence loomed large. Stalin trusted his judgment even when it clashed with his own. That alone was rare, dangerous even. And when the war ended, Zhukov stood at the heart of the Soviet victory parade, astride a white horse, the symbol of triumph made flesh. But Stalin feared legends. Zhukov was sidelined, demoted, buried in bureaucracy. Not for failure, but for success that outshone the state. Still, no demotion could erase what he did. His name is etched into the history of World War II like a battle scar across the face of Europe. When people talk about who defeated Hitler, there's always debate. But if you follow the trail of wrecked panzer divisions, shattered army groups, and fallen capitals, it ends at Zhukov's boots. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Be sure to let us know in the comment section below which of these generals is your favorite. Did we perhaps miss any generals that you think should have been included in this list? Let us know all that down below, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.